Okay, I'm going to have a quick review of how to use the quadratic formula to solve quadratic equations. You did this in Algebra 1, and you may or may not remember it, but we'll just do this review. So we need to remember two things. First of all, that the quadratic formula is for quadratic equations, meaning there's an x to the squared is the highest term, in standard form. ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0 is the standard form. So if it's not in standard form, we need to rearrange it and get it there. The second thing to remember about the quadratic formula is it always works. We try factoring because factoring is simpler, and that's fine, but only a small percentage of equations are really factorable. And every equation can be solved, or quadratic equation can be solved using the quadratic formula. So it's good to have this one in your comfort zone so that you can solve any problem, especially if you have real-world problems that's going to end up with decimal answers. You can't factor those. Those are going to be solved with our quadratic formula. So if you don't remember, the quadratic formula is x is equal to negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared over minus 4ac all over 2a. This. So if you don't have that, you don't know that, that should be in your notes right now. Depending on who your teacher was for algebra, you may have a song to help you remember this. When I was in algebra, way back in the day, we learned this to row, row, row your boat. I don't know why. So we learned something like x is equal to negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all divided by 2a. Thank you. So it is helpful. Music is an amazing thing to help you remember. So whatever you need to do, remember that equation. Now, let's take a quick review of how we've used this so far. Here's an equation. I know it's quadratic because of this, but it is not in standard form. So step one, let's put it in standard form. I'm going to add the 4x over, subtract the 6, and here's my equation now in standard form. Now, step two is I'm going to make sure I know what my a, b, and c are so I can plug those into the equation. And a is always the leading coefficient, b is the coefficient of the middle term, and c is the coefficient or the constant at the end. Notice though that this is going to be a negative 6. Each one of those coefficients, a, b, and c, is going to take the sign with it that's in the equation. Okay? So our next step is going to be, let's plug in those values. So x is equal to negative b, negative 4, plus or minus the square root of b squared, 4 squared, minus 4 times a times c. And notice I put my negative 6 in there for c. And then all over 2 times a, and that's what this is. So now, I always, when I do it, I will actually write this out that way the first time to make absolutely sure I don't mess up a negative sign or I don't miss a number. I write it out. The second step that I will do is actually now start simplifying those numbers. So I go inside the parentheses first. 4 squared becomes 16, and 4 times 3 times negative 6 is negative 72. And look what I've done for myself to make sure that I don't miss that it's minus minus. So I'm actually going to do a plus right here. So when I do, I get negative 4 plus or minus the square root of 88 over 6. Now the square root of 88 is not a perfect square, so sometimes, depending on the kind of problem, we'll factor that down with prime factorization and get our radicals simplified. Sometimes, if it's a real-world situation, we will use our calculator and get it in a decimal form. So just to see what that's like, I put the square root of 88 in my calculator, and I got 9.35. So once I'm down to this simplified equation, I'm going to split this plus minus into two equations. One to represent the plus, and a second one to represent the minus, because the answer is going to have two versions, a plus and a minus. So when I took negative 4 plus 9.35, I got 5.35 over 6, and I divided it, and the answer was 0.89. That's one of my answers. And then I said negative 4 minus 9.35. That gave me negative 13.35 over 6, and that one is negative 2.2. So what does this mean? I have two solutions to the equation because it's quadratic, and these are the two solutions that I would write down. Okay? Okay, make sure you notice we will get two answers because it's a quadratic equation. Number two, at the end, you will split that into two. When you see plus or minus, that means they've combined two different scenarios. And when we get all the way down to the end, we're going to split it. This one represents plus, this one represents minus, and solve for two different situations. Now that's the review portion. So what's new this year? What's new this year is when sometimes when we use these quadratics, we will divide and put our numbers together in our quadratic equation and find out that we get a square root of a negative number. And in the past we've said, oh, that's undefined. I can't get a square root of a negative number, so I have to stop. Now you can. So let's talk about that situation and what those numbers are called and do. So here I have a quadratic. 4x squared minus 8x equals negative 11. But it's not in standard form, so I move it over. I'm going to add 11 to both sides to make it in standard form, and here I go. 4x squared minus 8x plus 11 equals 0, standard form. Now I'm going to plug into my equation. I wrote the equation down to remind us, and I'm going to keep track of these negative signs very closely. Negative b, and b is negative 8, so see how I have negative negative? Plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c. Okay? All over 2 times a. So I'm set and I'm ready to simplify. Starting inside the radical sign, negative 8 squared is 64. 4 times 11 is 176. So I have to do 64 minus 176, and that's over 8, and my negative negative became a positive 8. Okay? So here's what I simplify to. 8 plus or minus the square root of negative 112 over 8. So the problem is I can't take the square root of a negative number. So I did come over here and simplify. I can split this into two different fractions. The first fraction is just 8 over 8, and the second fraction is the square root of negative 112 over 8. So that's all I did here. And I did that so I could simplify 8 over 8 into 1. But I can't get rid of the rest of this yet. So let's talk about what do I do when I have a negative sign inside the radical. Because if I multiply a number times itself and they're both positive, then I should have a positive in here. If I multiply a number by itself and they're both negative, I should have a positive. So what in the world happened that I would have a negative in here? That's what we need to discuss. In order to account for this situation, there's a new number called an imaginary number, and it's an I. This is like a cursive I for imaginary. Okay? What I represents is the square root of negative 1. The situation when I have a square root that has a negative number inside means that I can bring the negative 1 out as an I. So let's come up here. I had my negative 112. First thing I'm going to do is pull the negative 1 over here so I can just work with my positive numbers. So I'm going to factor this. 112, I got 2 and 56. I factored that and got 2 and 28. I factored that and got 4 and 7. Okay? So I have a 2 times 2 here, so that comes out as a 2. I have a 2 and a 2 here, so that comes out as a 2. 2 times 2 is 4. And I'm stuck inside with my negative and my 7. This is my simplified version of that radical. Now, I'm not allowed to have that negative in the radical to be simplified. So I'm allowed to say, in place of that I, I'm going to bring out, in place of that negative 1 rather, I'm going to bring out an I over here. So 4 times the square root of negative 7 is actually 4I times the square root of 7. Okay? Now I have a radical with only a positive number in it, so it's simplified. Let me have you take a look at a few of these. If I have negative 5, I really have a negative 1 times 5. The negative 1 comes out as an I. The 5 stays where it is. This one I have a negative square root of 4. Square root of negative 4, excuse me. The negative comes out as an I, and now I have just a square root of 4, which is 2. So my answer to this is 2I. In this one, the negative sign can come out as an I, and now I have the square root of 16, which is 4. So the answer is 4I. Here's a situation. I have the negative sign is going to come out as an I, and then I'm going to factor 12 and see what I have. And I come up with 4 and 3. 4 is going to be 2 times 2, so it comes out as a 2. 3 can't come out, so it stays inside. So this would be 2I square root of 3. Okay? Every time I have that negative inside the square root sign, it can come out as an I. The rest of it gets factored just like normal, simplified just like normal. I just have got an I added to the final answer. Let's go back and look now at 1 plus or minus the square root of negative 112 over 8. Well, I factored 112. Bloop, 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 right? And I got 4I times the square root of 7. So I have 1 plus or minus 4I square root of 7 over 8. Since I can't simplify this one into real normal numbers on the calculator, there's no reason for me to separate my answers. I'm going to keep my answers as plus or minus because I can't combine 1 and 4i. It's kind of like that I acts as x's. You can't combine a regular number with a number that has a variable attached to it. So I can do this though. This is a fraction. And in the numerator there's a 4, and it's all multiplied together. And in the denominator there's an 8. So I can use my same rules and say, let's divide both this numerator and this denominator by 4. And when I do, I get I over 2, simplified. So this fraction could be simplified because I was multiplying, both of them were multiplied by a factor of 4, and I divided it out. This would be my final answer to that first problem. 1 plus or minus I square root of 7 over 2. Okay, that's what we're going to be doing, and we're going to be practicing this a whole bunch in class. What I'd like you to do right now is write this problem down, and this problem should come out with a negative sign and give you the opportunity to try the I idea. Write it down in your notes, try it out on your own, and come in to class with some questions, and we will go over the details.